Hello, and welcome to the Velvet Lantern. I'm Lucas, and tonight I invite you to leave the noise of the day behind. Take a slow, gentle breath in, and softly let it go. Allow your shoulders to relax, your thoughts to grow quiet, and your heart to drift into a peaceful world of moonlight, warm lanterns, and whispering forests. Tonight's story is The Moonlit Cottage at Whispering Hill. There is a place, if you know where to look, where the world grows softer around the edges. It lies beyond the last crooked lane of the village, past the orchard where apple trees bow with the weight of remembering, up a winding path that forgets itself in ferns and foxgloves. At the top of Whispering Hill, where the wind learns to speak in gentle rhymes, stands a cottage made of honey-coloured stone and kindness. And tonight, the door is open. Elderly Miss Bramble had lived in the cottage for so long that the house had begun to remember things for her. The rafters held the scent of rosemary bread baked 20 autumns ago. The kitchen floor remembered the rhythm of her mother's dancing feet. And the front gate, oh, the front gate was something special indeed. It was a wrought iron gate, curly and patient, and at its centre hung a lantern that had never once gone out. Not during the great storm of '87, and the hill shivered and the oaks held hands to keep from falling. Not during the still winter, when even the river stopped to think. The lantern burned with a flame the colour of apricot jam at dawn, and it knew exactly who needed to find their way up the hill. Tonight, the flame flickered once, twice, a signal only the cottage understood. Someone was coming. Inside, Miss Bramble stirred a pot of something that smelled like honey and starlight. Her hands were gnarled as old roots, but they moved with the certainty of someone who had spent 80 years learning how to be gentle. She hummed a tune that had no beginning and no end. The kind of tune you might hear if you pressed your ear to a seashell and listened very, very carefully. "He's tired," she said to the cat. He was not a cat at all, but had agreed to wear that shape for the evening. The cat blinked slowly, once for yes, twice for perhaps. The cottage responded. The fire in the hearth leaned a little to the left, stretching its warmth toward the door. The kettle began to sing, soft as a lullaby, and the armchair by the window, the one with the patchwork quilt and the pillow that still held the shape of 100 peaceful heads, puffed itself up like a hen settling on a nest. Someone was coming, and he was very, very tired. His name was Elias, though he had nearly forgotten that fact somewhere between the last train and the unmarked path that appeared only when you stopped looking for it. He had been walking for what felt like hours, though the sky above the wood had not changed. It hung there, a deep velvet blue, pricked with stars that seemed closer than stars had any right to be. The trees on either side of the path leaned inward, not in a menacing way, but like old friends who wanted to hear a secret. Elias had no secret to tell. That was the problem, really. He had carried too many secrets for too long, and they had grown heavy in his chest, like stones in a coat pocket. He had come to the wood because he had nowhere else to go, because the city had grown too loud, the days too bright, the nights too empty. His feet hurt, his heart hurt, and somewhere deep in his bones, he had stopped believing that anything could feel warm again. And then he saw the lantern. It hung in the distance, a small amber star at the top of a hill, and something about it made his breath catch. Not because it was strange, though it was, in a world where most lights were harsh and hurried, but because it looked exactly like the light he had dreamed about as a child, back when he still believed that someone, somewhere, might be waiting for him. The path inclined gently upward. The trees began to thin, replaced by drifts of moonlight that pooled on the ground like spilled cream. Elias heard music, not quite music, but something close. The rustle of leaves that wanted to be a lullaby, the whisper of ferns that had learned to say rest now in a language older than words. He walked on. The gate swung open before he touched it. Elias stopped at the threshold, suddenly uncertain. The cottage before him was small and crooked and absolutely beautiful. Smoke curled from its chimney in ribbons of silver. The windows glowed with a light that seemed to breathe. And growing up the walls, twining around the doorframe, was a climbing rose that had burst into bloom with flowers the colour of blush and memory. "You don't have to knock," said a voice, soft as moss. The door had opened. Behind it stood a woman so old that her wrinkles looked like a map of somewhere beautiful. Her eyes were the colour of tea with milk, and they held no judgment at all. "I've been keeping the kettle warm," said Miss Bramble. "You look like someone who forgot that warmth exists." Elias wanted to say something clever or grateful, or at least polite. But what came out was, "I don't know how I got here." "Of course you don't," she said, stepping aside. "That's how you know you were supposed to." The inside of the cottage was larger than the outside had any right to be. Not in a way that made sense to mathematicians, but in a way that made perfect sense to anyone who had ever needed a place to rest. The ceiling was low and beamed with oak. The floor was stone, warmed by a rug that looked like it had been woven from sunset and sheep's wool. In the corner, a fireplace crackled with flames that were somehow both blue and gold, and the fire gave off a heat that felt less like temperature and more like forgiveness. Elias sat down in the armchair by the window. He hadn't meant to. He had intended to remain standing, to explain himself, to apologize for intruding. But the chair had other plans. It wrapped around him like a hug from someone who had been waiting a very long time. The cat that was not a cat appeared on his lap. It weighed nothing and everything, and it began to purr in a frequency that seemed to loosen the stones in Elias's chest, one by one. Miss Bramble brought him tea in a cup so thin he could see the light through it. The tea was the colour of autumn and smelled like… what? Like his grandmother's kitchen. Like the first day of spring. Like the moment just after a good cry, when you realise you're going to be okay. "Drink slowly," she said. "The tea is made from moonflowers and patience. It works better if you don't rush." Elias drank. The warmth spread through him like a sunrise, and for the first time in months, he realized he had been cold. So cold. He hadn't even noticed. "I don't have anything to pay you with," he said, because that was what the world had taught him to say. Miss Bramble sat down in the rocking chair across from him. The firelight danced on her face, and she smiled in a way that made her wrinkles look like the ripples in a pond after a skipping stone. "Child," she said, and she called everyone child, even people older than herself. "This cottage has been paid for 1,000 times over by everyone who ever sat in that chair and let themselves rest. Your job is not to pay. Your job is to stay. Just for tonight," Elias said, though something in him already knew that was a lie. "Just for tonight," Miss Bramble agreed, and her eyes said, "We'll see." Elias slept that night in a bed that seemed to have been invented by someone who had studied the exact shape of exhaustion. The sheets were linen, soft as prayer, and the pillow smelled of lavender and something deeper, something like the earth after rain, or the inside of a seashell, or the moment before you fall asleep when you remember that you are safe. He dreamed of a river. It was not a frightening dream. It was a gentle one, the kind that feels like a conversation with yourself. The river ran through a meadow where the grass was silver with moonlight, and the water moved so slowly you could see the stars reflected in it, one by one, like they were swimming downstream to somewhere kinder. On the far bank stood a tree he had known as a boy, an oak with a swing tied to its lowest branch. The rope was frayed now, and the swing hung empty, and Elias felt something crack open in his chest when he saw it. He sat down by the river and put his hand in the water. It wasn't cold. It was exactly the temperature of healing, which is to say, it was neither too hot nor too cold, but exactly right, like a bath drawn by someone who loves you. And then he heard her voice. "You've been carrying it for so long," said the river. Or maybe it was the tree. Or maybe it was the moonlight. Or the memory of his mother. Or all of them at once. The guilt. The grief. The belief that you had to be strong and silent and small. Elias nodded. His throat was too full for words. "Here," said the voice. "You can put it down." He looked at his hands. He hadn't realized he was holding anything, but now he saw that between his fingers was a small stone, grey and heavy, worn smooth by how tightly he had gripped it. He couldn't remember picking it up. He couldn't remember a time when he hadn't been holding it. "Go on," said the voice. "The river will take it. Rivers are very good at carrying things. That's what they're for." Elias opened his fingers. The stone fell into the water with a sound like a sigh, and the river closed over it without a ripple. He woke up with tears on his face and the feeling that something in his chest had been unknotted. Miss Bramble was sitting in the rocking chair, knitting something that looked like it might become a cloud. She didn't ask if he was okay. She just handed him a handkerchief, embroidered with a small, smiling moon. "Breakfast," she said, "will be ready when you are. There's no hurry. The cottage has learned to be patient." After breakfast, which was porridge with honey and a handful of blackberries that tasted like July, Miss Bramble took Elias into the garden. It was not a large garden. It was the kind of garden that grew in the spaces where a person had loved things into existence. Lavender spilled over the stone path like a purple river. Rosemary grew in bushes so old they had become trees. And in the back, behind the tumble-down shed, there was a gate covered in ivy that led to somewhere else entirely. "The garden of almost forgotten things," Miss Bramble said, pushing the gate open. "But don't show it to everyone, only the ones who need it." Elias stepped through. The garden was a meadow, but not quite. It was a forest, but not quite. It was a place where the light fell in golden shafts, and the air smelled of honeysuckle and old books, and the particular sweetness of a memory you had forgotten you had. And scattered throughout the grass, growing like wildflowers, were objects. A child's red balloon, still floating at the end of its string. A pair of reading glasses, perched on a mushroom. A letter, half unfolded, its ink faded, but still legible. A photograph of a woman laughing. A key. A song. A handful of coins that shone like promises. "This is where things go," Miss Bramble said softly. "When someone loses them, but still needs them. Not lost things, you understand. Almost forgotten things. The things your heart put on the shelf and meant to come back to." Elias walked through the garden slowly. He passed a small wooden boat that he remembered carving with his father. He passed a seashell that had once sat on his nightstand. He passed a scarf that had belonged to a friend he hadn't spoken to in years. And then he stopped. On a small patch of moss, nestled among clover, lay a single word. It was written in light, or perhaps in air, or perhaps in a language that only hearts could read. The word was forgive. He knelt down beside it. The word glowed softly, and as he watched, it began to change. It shifted like water, like smoke, like the moment when a song changes key and becomes something new. Forgive yourself, it said now. Elias reached out his hand. His fingers passed through the word, and when they did, he felt something release in his chest, something he had been holding since he was small, since the first time someone told him he wasn't enough, since the first time he believed it. He didn't cry, not yet. He just sat there in the golden light of the garden, surrounded by almost forgotten things, and let himself feel the truth that had been waiting for him all along. He was allowed to rest. He was allowed to be held. He was allowed to come home. That evening, Miss Bramble led Elias to the top of the hill behind the cottage. The world spread out below them like a quilt of shadows and starlight. The village was a scatter of warm, yellow windows. The wood was a dark sea of whispering leaves. And above it all, the moon rose, full and silver, and so close that Elias felt he could reach out and touch it. The moon comes here every night, Miss Bramble said. She says this is her favourite hill. The view is best, and the people who sit here are always the ones who need her most. They sat on a bench that had grown there, not placed, but grown, from some kind of wood that smelled like sandalwood and centuries. The cat that was not a cat curled between them. Will I remember this when I leave? Elias asked quietly. Miss Bramble considered the question. You will remember what you need to remember. Some things are too large to hold all at once. They come back to you in dreams, in dewdrops, in the moment before you fall asleep, when you feel, for no reason at all, that everything is exactly as it should be. The moon rose higher. Somewhere in the wood, a nightingale began to sing, not a sad song, but a lullaby, soft and patient and full of grace. Can I stay longer than tonight? Elias asked. Miss Bramble smiled. You can stay as long as you need. The cottage has a way of measuring time differently. The day can be a year, and the year can be a moment. You will leave when you are ready, not when the clock says so. Elias looked up at the moon. He thought about the river and the garden and the stone he had been carrying. He thought about the word forgive and how it had changed when he was brave enough to look at it. For the first time in a very long time, he felt something that might have been hope. Or maybe it was just the moonlight. Maybe they were the same thing. Elias stayed for 7 days, or 7 years, or 7 heartbeats. Time in the cottage was slippery, and he stopped trying to measure it. He learned to bake bread with Miss Bramble, her hands guiding his, showing him how to knead until the dough felt like a living thing. He learned to listen to the cats purr and understand that sometimes silence was the truest conversation. He sat by the fire and read old books whose pages felt like dried leaves, and he discovered that the stories inside them were all, in some way, about him. On his last night, though he didn't know it was his last night, he sat alone in the armchair by the window. The fire had burned down to embers, and the embers glowed like sleepy stars. The lantern at the gate flickered once, softly, and then settled into a calm, steady burn. Outside, the wind whispered through the roses. "Stay," it seemed to say. "Stay a little longer." But Elias knew, in the quiet way that people know things when they are ready to know them, that he was done hiding. The cottage had given him what he needed. Not a place to live, but a place to remember how to live. The rest he would have to carry with him. Miss Bramble appeared in the doorway, holding a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "Moonflower tea," she said, "for the hard nights, and a little bit of starlight in case you forget how to find your own." Elias took the parcel. His hands didn't shake anymore. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt like they meant something. Miss Bramble kissed his forehead. Her lips were dry and soft, and when she pulled away, he saw that her eyes were wet, but not sad. They were the eyes of someone who had watched 1,000 people find their way home, and who would watch 1,000 more, and who found joy in every single one. "The gate will always open," she said. "The lantern will always burn. And you, dear child, you will always be welcome here." Elias walked down the hill as the sun began to rise, painting the clouds in shades of peach and lavender. The path was easier than it had been on the way up. His feet felt lighter. His chest felt wider. And when he reached the edge of the wood, he turned back once to look at the cottage. It was small and crooked, and absolutely beautiful. Smoke curled from its chimney. The roses nodded in the morning breeze. And the lantern at the gate, even in daylight, even as the sun climbed higher, still burned with its warm, patient flame. He smiled. Then he turned and walked into the world, carrying the cottage with him in a place no one could see. And now, dear listener, the moon is high and the night is soft. The wind outside your window is the same wind that whispers through the roses on Whispering Hill. The stars above you are the same stars that watched over Elias as he slept in the Moonlit Cottage. You've been walking a long time, haven't you? Carrying things that were never yours to carry, holding stones that belong in rivers, forgetting that you, too, are allowed to rest. But listen, somewhere, in a place beyond maps and miles, a lantern is burning just for you. A kettle is warming, an armchair is waiting, and a woman with eyes like tea and milk is keeping the door open, just in case. So close your eyes now. Let your breath grow slow and deep, like the tide going out. Let your body sink into the warmth of your bed, into the safety of this moment, into the knowledge that you are exactly where you need to be. The fire has burned down to embers. The moon has risen to her favourite hill. And you, dear heart, you are safe. You are held. You are loved, not for what you do or carry or become, but for the simple, sacred fact that you exist. Sleep well. The cottage will still be there when you wake, and the lantern never goes out. Good night.